Welcome to this newest episode of Coming to the West. It's a little show from Ronin Geek Official Podcast, co-creator Alex Austin. And in this show, we do a couple things. We evaluate the historical and cultural value of games once they come over from Japan and hit the West. And we also talk about the history of the game itself and how it ended up coming into being and even getting onto Western shores. And with that, let's go ahead and get started. I chose to cover Chulip for the second episode of Coming to the West because it's historically and culturally significant for one reason and one reason alone. Most of the strange and bizarre games that are made in Japan, and in particular those made before the onset of digital game downloads, were filtered out from release in the West due to the prohibitive costs of advertising and localization on the physical format. So most of us have heard of bizarre Japan-only titles like Namco Bandai's Muscle March or LSD Dream Emulator on PS1. You can find plenty of videos of those on YouTube and online. Or the infamous Cho Aniki series, which I won't go into detail about here, but suffice it to say it's a little more offbeat than even Chulip. But a handful of strange titles have managed to make it through over the years, like the Dreamcast launch title / Evolution emulator, Seaman, or the uncomfortably voyeuristic Mr. Mosquito, and of course, the title we're covering today, Chulip. Some of the more offbeat ones, like Katamari Damacy, end up being huge hits in the West, spawning multiple titles over multiple years. However, Chulip was not one destined to become a big hit. In fact, the English localization of Chulip was so unlikely that it took 3 years to accomplish, including outsourcing by Natsume and a massive North American games retailer to finally make it happen. As far as the Japanese sales figures go, this game was not a success. Chulip moved fewer than 7,000 copies in Japan upon multiple releases, which is another reason why it's so unlikely to have been localized in the first place for the West. It was originally released in Japan on October 3rd, 2002, and did not come to North America until February 2007. The release of Chulip in exclusivity with GameStop happened very late in the localization cycle of the game, which was indicated in an article I found on Silicon Era from January 19th, 2007, a mere 25 days before its North American release. I'll include the link to that in the notes. It's just bizarre to think that here's a game that was literally being localized over the course of 3 years, including an expensive outsourcing project from Natsume, but still did not have any advertising in the West until GameStop picked it up less than a month before its release. The article itself is an interview with Natsume's Graham Marquet, who is currently listed as the Vice President of Operations for Natsume North America, according to his LinkedIn profile. The interview establishes that the release date of the game is set for February 13th of 2007, but it makes no mention at that point of the GameStop exclusivity. Ultimately, the game was picked up for pre-order by GameStop as a retail exclusive title, which I'm not sure from my research had ever happened before with a mainstream publisher localization in North America, which makes this a very unique launch. The game was released as a budget title for $20 in the US, and even though I couldn't find US sales figures, it must have only sold a few thousand copies. Because of its potential rarity, it's currently going for about $60 to $70 on the used game resale sites. Now, regarding the advertising for Chulip, it's almost non-existent. It would have been relegated to just the flyer for GameStop at the time of its release in 2007, and the only commercial I could actually find was a 15-second clip that probably came off of a PS2 demo disc from Japan. I'll go ahead and play that here for you to take a peek.
冒険活劇チューリップ
After quite a bit of research, the story of Chulip and how it came to be, along with its influences, started to emerge, and it may have some interesting pedigree behind it, if not a bit unexpected. And this is why I love doing these retrospectives, because in researching, you'll learn about industry connections and intertwining influences that propel the industry forward in various capacities, which you'll see very shortly. So how exactly did this game get made in the first place? So it was developed by Punchline, a studio that spun off from Love Deluxe Studio that only ever did this and another game on PS2 called Rule of Rose, which is a melee-based survival horror game with some puzzle-solving elements, and it was generally received a little bit better, I think, than Chulip. The history of Chulip, however, might might actually be rooted as far back as 1997 in the development of a game called Moon RPG Remix Adventure, which was published by none other than ASCII Entertainment. ASCII is actually behind the hardware called MSX. The studio who developed Moon, Lovedelic, was made up of several members who previously had worked for Squaresoft as various staffers on titles like Romancing Saga and possibly even Super Mario RPG or Chrono Trigger, based on the timeline of their employment before leaving Square. Even though I read that a few times in my research, I had trouble finding an exact place that quoted that, however, so just a heads up. A few notable members include Yoshiro Kimura, who worked as a writer and director on Chulip and later went on to work on Little King's Story, which came out back in 2012 on Wii and PlayStation Vita. He actually got his start working on Romancing Saga 1 and 2 at Square. Next up is Yasuhiro Wada, who was the producer on Chulip and had previously worked on the Harvest Moon and Story of Seasons series with Natsume. Wada would go on to become the COO of Goichi Suda's Grasshopper Studio, aka the talent behind Suda 51 hits like No More Heroes and Killer 7. Ryuji Noguchi worked the concept art for Chulip and previously had done artwork on the Harvest Moon series. Norokazu Yasunaga was the lead game designer on Chulip, and he went on to design the AI for Little King's Story under the direction of Yoshiro Kimura. So it's very cool to see these stories intertwining as these guys come together under Lovedelic Studio. Other members of the team had been staffers of Squaresoft along with Kimura before leaving to join Lovedelic, where many of the game design ideas that ultimately ended up in Chulip were cultivated, which brings us back to the discussion about the design concepts in Moon RPG Remix Adventure by Lovedelic Studio and how that matches up with Chulip. In my research, I found some definite through lines that carried forward from its development into Chulip, which helps us better understand how we arrived at Chulip. It also seems generally agreed upon that Moon was definitely the principal gameplay influence for Chulip, so here's a couple ways in which they closely compare. First, the game works on a real-time calendar with a day-night cycle, and characters follow their own set schedules by week. In Chulip, the NPC characters follow a set schedule based on a day-night cycle by day. Now, both games also feature an unnamed boy, and I say that in quotes, main character, who has to achieve goals by interacting with characters and achieving a goal. In Moon, the goal is to increase the boy's love level by discovering and granting NPC characters' dreams. In Chulip, the boy must discover the path to characters' affections through conversations and events that lead to kissing and increasing your kissing level. Chulip is actually referred to by Kimura as a kissing RPG, which is mostly true. While the game maintains many RPG mechanics, including level gains and HP, aka heart increases, there aren't any of the customization or progression trees like what you would see in more sophisticated RPGs. In fact, there isn't much to do that's particularly in-depth in the course of the game, other than some fetch quests and following the linear paths of each kissing story to up your ability and potential favor with the girl in the game you actually want to kiss. The goal of increasing your kissing level, as far as Chulip is concerned, is to kiss the girl of your dreams in your new town you just moved to. Coincidentally, she initially rejects you heartily and over because you come from a poor background, which ignites your motivation to kiss everything and everyone you can get your lips on in the game. On a side note, it's hilarious just how dirt poor everyone seems to know you are, and you hear about it all the time in the early game. Of course, working toward your goal is not without its dangers. Along the way, you have to avoid nightmarish terrors like a trigger-happy police officer who prowls the night streets, a town doctor who will forcibly remove your life essence with a giant needle at night, and a whole host of dwellers from below who are prone to respond with violence if you attempt to kiss them at the wrong moment. Let's also not forget the bizarre townsfolk you interact with on a daily basis, like the man going about his business wearing nothing but a telephone pole, a woman with the head of an onion who gets your very first kiss of the game, or Mr. Binchotan, which literally translates to a jar for coal storage, who is a violent alcohol-fueled monk made of a wooden branch, who also happens to protect a divine blade that becomes central to one of the missions in the game. What's interesting about Chulip is there was some anticipation of its North American release. In fact, many of the articles that I read from back in 2007 and 2006 were regarding people not knowing exactly when it was coming, even though they felt it was promised by Natsume. How it resulted was in a mixed reception. In fact, currently the game is running 57% on Metacritic, and it has a 94% from Google users. Despite the strange and sometimes disturbing content of the game, most of the criticism I've read in my research is related to the sheer difficulty of the game, which manifests in some scenarios by forcing players to endure damage that can't be avoided. Therefore, you are just required to already have a high enough number of hearts to survive. Interestingly, Game Informer, a publication owned by GameStop, gave Chulip the honor of Worst Game of the Year in 2007. However, that was actually the same year as some other very questionable games in terms of quality. Vampire Reign comes to mind, which was a next-gen title for 360 and PS3 that just didn't do very well, and Wii Shovelware was becoming a major thing at this point. In fact, Game Party released in 2007, and basically the term shovelware was invented because of it. So I think, honestly, it was more of a middle-of-the-pack game than Worst Game of the Year. In conclusion, I can honestly say I appreciate Natsume's commitment to bring this game to the West, and I think there was some benefit of a company like GameStop getting behind the physical release of such an offbeat and unique title. Nowadays, the North American release of a game like Chulip would be relegated to digital download only, so this really is a one-of-a-kind release for its day, being that it wasn't backed by popularity in Japan, its localization took over 3 years, and its path to retail was advertised in a flyer of the biggest game seller in North America in just a matter of about 20 days, alongside AAA sellers of the day. We may never see another physical release quite like Chulip, and I genuinely recommend finding a way to play it if you're into the offbeat stuff. You won't regret it, or at least look it up on YouTube. There are a handful of playthrough videos. Thanks again for watching Coming to the West from Ronin Geek Official, and make sure to check out our podcast, Ronin Geek Official Podcast, on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, CastBox, iHeartRadio, or wherever else you find your geek comedy podcasts. Any subs and shares of our YouTube channel or podcast are greatly appreciated. Make sure to leave a comment below about what you'd like to see on a future episode of Coming to the West. Catch you later.